Welcome to This Old App, a podcast about learning, coding, smashing stuff together, breaking things apart, startups, failing, winning, and any other buzzwords we can think of.
Hey, Randy. Today we've got with us David Rogers. David is a senior software engineer with the Grove Collective and somebody I've known for many a year. So welcome, David.
Thanks for having me, guys.
Yeah, for sure. So David, as I said, David and I go back a ways, and it'd be folly to try and figure out how far back. But certainly back to the days when David used to live in Orlando, now live in North Carolina, correct, David? That's
right. Just outside of Raleigh, North Carolina. And we're in Durham for work these days.
Okay. So we used to run the same circles. David would run the local PHP meetup in addition to many others. He ran the coding dojo for a while, and I'd pop my head in those places every once in a while. Mainly because David's a good communicator and a good teacher, and whenever he's talking about something, you're going to learn something. So, and he's a good guy to hang around with too. So that's why we invited him on today as well. So David, after doing that for a few years, David, we actually worked together for about a year, correct?
That's right.
Yeah.
We were on the Coney rocket ship there for just a minute.
Rocket ship, without going too into the details, rocket ship could be the right explanation. So the right description, depending on which rocket ship you're talking about. So
right. It turns out whenever you set the back end of you on fire and try to aim for the stars, it's a risky proposition.
Yes.
But we had a good time. David was leading the engineering effort for the marketing side there, and he brought me in along with a few others to try and steer it in the right direction.
That's right.
We did about as well steering as you can on a rocket ship. So
right.
It was good times for the most part. I'm glad we had the time together.
Yeah, definitely.
It was good times, and
we both learned a lot.
What was Coney? Explain to me what Coney was, other than a rocket ship.
Oh, it was a rocket ship. Coney still is a enterprise grade mobile application development platform. It was one of those write in one language and deploy to native versions of iOS, Android, at the time BlackBerry, because BlackBerry was still making their own OS at the time.
Yeah.
Windows Phone was still around, all that stuff. So they had an IDE, and your developers would get access to the IDE and to their software. Your developers would build kind of a wireframe version of the app in their IDE, and then the IDE would build out native versions of the app in Android and iOS and so on and so forth, with kind of like a business logic piece running in JavaScript at the time, kind of like AppCellera Titanium or Xamarin, or those types of solutions.
So it's also like now people are using React Native and Cordova and Ionic and stuff like that. So that's what it was essentially doing.
Kind of, sort of. Ionic and React Native, yeah, they're building, taking JavaScript and actually transposing it directly into the native widgets. Coney's technology was slightly different in that it was mostly using JavaScript as glue between native components that they had built. Then you could style the components, but they were doing a similar translation exercise. Cool. And at the time, people were doing a lot of phone gap stuff. That was one of the targets that we hit as well. It was like, if you want an HTML5 phone gap wrapper as an initial go, then push that button too.
Yep.
Yeah. So But we both of us have moved on. So David is now, as I said earlier, senior software engineer at Grove Collective. So David, tell us a little bit about Grove Collective and what you're doing there.
Yeah. Well, Grove is, on the surface, an e-commerce company for eco-friendly home brands. We're that's, again, like I said, on the surface, right? We have a site. You can sign up through the site and get your favorite eco-friendly brands like Mrs. Meyer's and Burt's Bees and Seventh Generation and those sort of things delivered to your home on a regular subscription. So it's kind of like a subscription first model. But we also have our own flagship products that we manufacture, and they're also eco-friendly products. So we have a line of tree-free paper products for the home, toilet paper, tissue paper, paper towels, that sort of thing, that are made with no tree fiber at all. They're made from harvested bamboo and upcycled sugarcane. So that's one of our products. We have a bunch of other products that we also sell. We also manufacture and sell a lot of reusable vessels. We've got a laundry system that uses reusable vessels and low impact organic plastics for the containers, and non-petroleum, non-animal based detergents and that sort of thing. So it's like the Save the Planet version of all of your Tides and Cascades and that sort of thing. So we have that side. We have the manufacturing side. We also distribute all of the products that we sell from the vendors that we supply from, and we have the website that we supply. So we're kind of like a little baby Amazon, is how I describe it. We're making our own products. We're warehousing our own products. We're fulfilling our own products. We're handling customer support, and we're selling them on a subscription instead of kind of like stapling them on after the fact. Because wouldn't you love to have a subscription every year for that heat pump that you just bought?
Yeah.
Sure. So based on the news coming out today, I assume you all pay taxes as opposed to Amazon, correct?
Yeah.
Does New York care about you all as much as they care about Amazon? That's the question.
Well, that's the question, really. We're actually really big in New York and several of the other large metro areas, but we're really big out in the Midwest. We found that a lot of our customers are in the suburbs in the Midwest. The products that we sell are not as readily available in those markets, and people love just not having to go to Target and pay the extra Target markup for the special products at Target, and just having them delivered to their house.
Interesting.
So what? Go ahead, Randy.
Well, I was just saying, what brought you to this company? Like, what were you doing before, and what brought you to this new role?
Yeah. Well, before this, I was working for a hot startup in Raleigh called Pindo. They're a very different business. That was a traditional software as a service business, and it was kind of like the meta software as a service. It was software for a service for people who make software as a service so that they can make better software as a service. The analytics platform, we would collect all of the user activity for your users, for example, and we would display that in dashboards, but then you could also tag the features retroactively because we were collecting all the analytics, all of their activity all of the time. You could tag retroactive analytics, so you could pick up a feature that you didn't know was a feature, or you might have, it turns out that someone changed the path to that feature and you need to update that. Well, you can actually update it both so that you have both features, the old feature and the new feature, reporting on the same analytics. And then beyond that, you could set up messaging, so you could pop a light box or do a walkthrough, or just put a tooltip in the right place for specific users based upon their analytics and their activity. So that was big infrastructure. That was lots of crazy stuff, and very meta. Is definitely not something that's easy to explain to your grandmother.
Yeah.
The reason that I shifted was maybe I'd done 2.5 years at Pindo, and I just started. I got an email from Angel List about a company that was looking to come to North Carolina. Looked up the company, really liked what Grove was doing, so I just opened it and hey, let's just email this Chris guy and see what he's got to say. And he hooks me up with Noah, who's coming out to Raleigh, who was coming out to Raleigh at the time to set up a second office for them. we hit it off really well, and the opportunities that I had to lead, to help them work through several big migrations, the types of problems that they were dealing with, the baby Amazon scale, like their growth curve, where they had just had a huge uptick in users and orders. They were having to scale up to that. Like, the problem seemed really interesting. The culture seemed very appealing, and it was something that I could explain to everyone.
Yeah. It's always harder when you can't really tell people what you do,
Right?
Because in their mind it defeats that you're doing anything.
Right.
So yeah, I've been there before.
I tell most people most of the time that I have built the internet one tube at a time for many years.
So you were at Coney, and I'm assuming between Coney and Pindo, what kind of work have you, like, all the way through, you've been working with mobile kind of front end types of things? I mean, Don mentioned PHP earlier,
Right.
But what's the trajectory of your technology you've been touching from Coney up to now? What have you been focused on?
Yeah, when I was Coney was kind of an inflection point for me. I had been doing a lot more back-end development and full stack development, and I mean, like, full stack from the point of writing the bash scripts that that boot the stupid thing all the way out to implementing the CSS, right? So I'd been doing that for many years with PHP, with Python and Django, with done many WordPress sites over the years. I got my start in Orlando, Florida, working for what became Purple Rock Scissors, a big agency down there in downtown Orlando. I was their first lead developer. And when I got to Coney, I was really interested I was very intrigued by what was coming out of the front-end development world. So Angular was pretty new, and I wanted to try to experiment with that. And they were nominally looking for someone to handle the marketing side of things. But once I got in there, I saw a big need for a project that they were trying to launch to put their on-premises solution, their standard on-premise appliance, into a cloud-based infrastructure and have a management portal and kind of have like a Heroku for Coney, which was very appealing to me. So that was why I ended up coming on with them, and that's also why I drug Don and Curtis and the rest of those guys into it with me, because I knew I wasn't going to be able to manage all of the marketing requests as well as build out this dashboard and the UI and the API for that. So that's kind of the project that I worked on Skunkworks while Don was helping me manage all of the marketing side. And that got me my first foot in the door with AngularJS and some of the reactive Vue components back in, 2013, 2014, Don? That was a long time ago. 2012, maybe? 2012.
Yeah, 2012 to 2013.
Yeah, and just after that, I ended up I went back to freelance after working with Coney for about a year and a half, and ended up working with Code School on their Shaping Up with AngularJS course. So that was the release of Angular 1.2, and Google was really hot about these new changes that they had made to the API that really confused the heck out of everybody who had been using it prior to that. So Code School got a contract with Google to build out an Angular course, but the only people they had on board that really knew Angular were the ones that were building their learning management system using AngularJS. They were all great teachers, just at capacity. So I got a chance to work with Greg. I wrote that course. I built all the slides. I built the examples. I even got to direct Greg during the video shooting, which was anytime you kind of hear somebody giggling in the background a little bit, that was me. We had a great time with that course. I did some follow-up podcasts and video casts, screencasts with them on some material. But that really launched me into full-time front-end development. I've done plenty of back-end work since then, but getting into Angular and then getting into React and getting into all the things that have come afterwards have kind of been from that kicking off point at Coney, and then the Code School course. And after that, Greg introduced me to the folks at the Iron Yard, who were launching a 12-week immersive boot camp for retraining folks into software development. I taught the front end cohort there for a year in Orlando, and then about a half a year up in Raleigh, Durham. Helped them launch another campus. I was heavily involved with that, but I was teaching JavaScript with a side of HTML and CSS only as needed for a year and a half. That was fantastic. But and now I'm mostly front end. That's kind of been my trajectory. It's like you learn what you need to learn when you need to learn it, and if it turns out to be really fun, maybe you get to stay with it.
So then for the last two jobs, and I know the answer, but I'm asking basically for the listeners, what have you been specifically doing with the front end with the last two positions?
Yeah. So at Pindo, it was Angular. They were on a very old version of Angular. They were still on Angular 1.2 at the time that I came on back in 2016. And they had a pretty small, lightweight, understaffed front end team. But most of the business logic for their application was built in the front end. The back end was kind of an agnostic API. It was a custom query language, kind of like MongoDB's aggregation pipeline, just specifically for the types of events that we were collecting for analytics purposes. So what I got to do there was help build out that team, help build out the strategy for hiring, and one of the first things that I implemented was pull requests and code reviews and formalizing that. And then from the front end architecture standpoint, we started upgrading to later versions of Angular. We made small jumps, 1.2 to 1.3 to 1.4 to 1.5 to eventually 1.6. We started integrating some other tools and things. But Angular 1.2, at the time that we started making the upgrades from 1.x, Angular had already been end of life, right? Like they'd already been off the end of life on Angular. And at the time, it's like all open source projects, like Angular 1.4 will be the last release of Angular. And the community outcries. And strangely, there's a 1.5 will be the last release of Angular. 1.63, we swear, will be the last release of Angular. 1.72, I'm pretty confident will maybe end the life of Angular. But the writing was still on the wall, right? Google was not throwing its full weight at the Angular 1.2 or 1.x project. They moved on to Angular 2. We were looking at what comes next for us. Are we gonna go with Angular 2? How do we go to Angular 2? How do we migrate to Angular 2? Does anybody really want to migrate to Angular 2? We looked at some other options. I had done some teaching with Vue. There were some other folks that were very excited about maybe using Vue. We had folks that we had hired on that had lots of experience with React. So we kind of did a shootout between the three, between Vue and React and Angular 2.0 and or 2, 5, 7, 9, whatever prime number we're releasing this week. So we did that for like, I guess 3 months. We did a shootout and tried to figure out which one we wanted to go with. And
can we talk about that? I mean, this is what a lot of companies go through right now, because the front end framework business is just nothing but radical change, new features, new ways of. So when you did the shootout, we have a mix of developers that have egos and they like a certain thing. You have the companies like Google that what is Google going to do with Angular? Are they going to fall on their face? Vue is brand new at the time. React is really strong, but backed by a company that no one trusts necessarily. So like, can you talk about the shootout? What you remember the strongest about it? How you came to a choice, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I think so. We kind of had a powwow of the interested parties on the front end team, and we had a discussion. We said, these are kind of the three strongest options. There were some dark horse candidates that were thrown in there, like RxJS. There are people that just threw out answers that didn't even make sense. Like, we could build this with RxJS. I don't think that's what that is. There were some folks that were really hot for the new Angular, for Angular IO. There were some folks that were really hot for React that had done a lot of very very good work with React, and there were some folks that were interested in and had done some work with Vue. We picked one person from each one of those camps and said, go build the same thing in all three of these, and soup to nuts, total greenfield. But also, like try to figure out how we would integrate this into what we're going to do now. Like what are some of the pros and cons? What are some of the things that we need to consider? What are some of the pieces of the ecosystem that we need to look at? And we had several conversations over probably, the course of 3 months, really. Like we'd have these meetings every other week, and people would make progress and report on their progress. People would show more or less work. People would have, these giant issues that they were working on in GitHub, and they would be adding comments to them and doing pull requests to do code reviews with these proof of concepts. And we just kind of settled on we should go with Vue for these reasons, that it was a closer syntax to AngularJS. It was another architectural and API improvement over what React had established. There was less bike shedding and debate to be had about the ecosystem. If you use Vue, you use Vue Router and you use Vuex, or you don't use Vuex, or you don't use Vue Router. There's not the bifurcation, multiplication of ecosystems that you see in React, right? Where there's like 7 different, pretty decent answers to everything, right?
Yes.
We're going to use React, we're going to use Redux, and maybe we're going to use MobX, or maybe we're going to use Rx. We're just going to like shimmy Rx into there somehow. So that was a big deciding factor as well. Like there was a very clear set of tools that we would be using if we chose Vuex, and the syntax was designed to be very similar to Angular, and we could start refactoring. We had a path that we could refactor towards these ES6 module type services that would work inside of Angular, inside of our existing code base, but then we could start reusing in whatever framework we chose.
Did you get significant blowback from either of the people voting for sticking with Angular or the React side?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think the folks that were on the Angular side, the Angular 2.0, 2.79, whatever it is, they came around on their own a little more. They did their proof of concept, and they showed off their work, and everyone who was looking at their work, including them, were like, so this is kind of weird and this is kind of funky. And this actually changed halfway through the proof of concept, which only lasted a few weeks. And this API is completely deprecated now. And the build system is changing. And you know what? Let's just not do this.
Yeah.
There was just way too much flux inside of the Angular 2.0 replacement. And there was still this concept that if we went with Angular 2, we weren't getting anything for choosing Angular 2. We were going to be rewriting almost everything in Angular 2.
Yeah.
Late in the game, the Angular team announced that they were going to embed Angular 1.5 plus 1.6 in Angular 2 as a backwards compatibility mode, so that you could slowly migrate your stuff over. And that just made everybody throw their hands up. They're like, "What?" So we'll get Angular 2 and Angular 1 at the same time, but maybe not.
Yeah.
That was, if we're going to rewrite it, let's just rewrite it. Let's just figure out a way to rewrite it.
Now, I want to stay on this path, but I do want to ask one sidebar question. Did you all look at Elm or Ember?
We did. Well, it was brought up, right? Those are the dark horse candidates. No one had any experience with Elm, and most of the folks that we had on the team were struggling already with RxJS. We had incorporated RxJS and some of the functional programming that even Rx implements was probably going to be a little more than what these folks were used to. And we did not want to have some like central Elm guru be the bottleneck that everyone had to go through. The documentation on the big three the amount of resources out there for people to learn the big three was much greater than any of the others. And nobody really had a taste for Ember, to be really honest. We looked at Ember. Our API was not structured in a way that would make Ember data even useful for us. And no one was really excited about basically rewriting all of the models in Ember.
Yeah.
Ember to me has always felt like the Rails of JavaScript, trying to be the Rails of JavaScript.
Totally.
Which, if you're a full stack developer, which I was for a long time, especially when Ember was gaining popularity, it felt like you were rewriting everything twice, right? The dry principle is don't repeat yourself, and then the wet principle is write everything twice. It felt very wet that I was having to write all these models in Rails or Django or whatever on the back end and expose them via an API, and then have to write the models again, define the exact same models again in the front end with Ember. Even if I was doing something just ever so slightly different, it still felt like I was just doing the same thing over again.
Yep.
So that's what informed. That's how you arrived at the decision at Pindo. How did you arrive at the decision to go with Vue at Grove? At Grove?
Well, so that decision was predates me a little bit. They did a similar shootout situation, but they were coming from a much older code base. The front end code had been written in Backbone and Marionette. Which is Randy and I were joking about before the show. That's kind of like the dawn of time of front-end frameworks. And that had worked out really well for them.
Backbone changed the game. Right. It suddenly gave us a way to organize what had been jQuery spaghetti for so long. Right. So it had kind of the outlet to finally bringing in data and managing data.
Right.
So that was
you had a strong.
That was the joy of it. Yeah, exactly.
And you didn't have to go crazy by defining I think that's where Ember got off the rails just a little bit. Is in Backbone you didn't have to go crazy defining all the properties of the resource that you were connecting to. You just kind of gave it a URL, and as long as it was a RESTful resource that returned JSON properties, Backbone would figure it out. And the Marionette side added a lot of extensibility to views. So like you're saying that before we had jQuery soup and all this event spaghetti all over the place. You trigger events on anything. There was no rhyme or reason to it. And Backbone at least gave us some clarity as to where the events go and how the handlers were set up. And then Marionette came along and said, well, let's extend that to the Backbone views, not just the models. Let's come up with a convention for views and routing.
And to your point, I mean, when you say that Ember was trying to be the Rails, when you look at who was building Ember, Hugo Katz, I mean, I have amazing respect for everything he's done in the open source world, but he tried to take on everything. And where you see the success of React and Vue has been they're starting small and like kind of nailing the piece on presentation and state management. And then incorporating, React has kind of outsourced all of the back end, all of the data layer. But
I don't know, like the GraphQL layer, that's also come out of that same community, right? Like that was another revolutionary. But React was a revolutionary point of inflection. A lot of people don't know that the JSX syntax that everybody loved to hate when React came out actually came from their PHP HTML syntax, PHX. They had a PHX first. And it didn't take off as well because you could already do HTML in PHP, and people really didn't see the value there. But then JSX came along, and that changed the game substantially. The whole idea of hyperscript, and I've got a declarative syntax to safely construct DOM nodes and to do so in an efficient manner. That really changed the game. But you're right. They stuck with that. Like, this is what we do. This is what we do.
Yep.
We render DOM node.
So we totally sidebarred Don's question. Going back to Grove.
Yeah.
You went through the same process, shorter process. Did you have arguments now of having gone through this before that you could give the team? Like, how did that second shootout?
Yeah, I wasn't actually on for the second shootout, but I got to see the after effects, and mostly the developers were just really hot on Vue. A lot of them had React experience, but even the React devs that were coming to the code base, when they saw what Vue could do, were just very impressed. And it also made a lot of sense, like for the same reasons that I heard the same reasons coming out of that shootout, or read the same reasons coming out of that shootout that had come out of the Pindo shootout. It was a syntax that was very familiar. It was kind of improving upon the best ideas from React and Redux and so on and so forth. And there was a very clear ecosystem, right? Like we didn't have to go have more bike shedding conversations about whether we're going to use Redux or MobX or whatever.
Yeah.
We're going to use Vuex. And we can start to refactor our existing backbone services to look like Vuex services in advance of that. That there was a path forward to refactor right now, and also materially improve our existing code base was a big boon. I think the thing that I was able to bring most to the Grove team, or the thing that I have been able to bring most to the Grove team, because of that experience with Pindo, was how the heck are we going to do that refactor? How are we going to change our existing code base in such a way that it makes it easy to move to Vue and to Vue Router and to Vuex? How are we going to integrate that into what we've got right now? What's the right cutover point? At Pindo, we tried both bottom up, so taking leaf nodes and making those Vue components and bridging them with Angular, and top down. Let's take an entire page or entire route and convert that over to Vue components, and see which one gives us the most value. At Grove, we don't have a lot of the reusable widgets. We don't have a lot of the widget depth that we did at Pindo. So I feel like doing the bottom-up approach and the top-down approach was valid at Pindo, is totally not valid at Grove. In order to get off of Angular as quickly as, get off onto Vue as quickly as possible and off of Backbone, we're taking it. If we're going to touch this, let's rewrite this whole route. It's only about 400 lines of HTML. It can't be that hard.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, you're talking about if you had Angular working, you had a framework which still has value. But when you are going from something like Backbone Marionette, greenfielding things seems to be the most efficient way to go about it. So talk a little bit about testing. This is kind of a total, left turn, but what is the testing story that you all use at both firms as you've employed Vue? Because that's one of the areas of the Vue side I haven't just heard as much chatter about. I've heard much more about Jest and React than I have anything else. So what do you all use for unit testing, integration testing, end to end? I'm kind of curious about
that. At Pindo, we had tests written in Jasmine originally, and that we were looking. None of us were particularly happy about the Jasmine suite, but we had it, and a lot of the tests were around the Angular services. There weren't as many tests around the components in Angular. In fact, a lot of the components were implemented as just giant controllers. And I did a lot of refactoring, and so did a lot of the folks that came on after me. Did a lot of refactoring to get those into testable services instead of just one giant controller. Here at Grove, they've been on Jest for a while because they were originally on Jasmine, and they made the switch over just like Pindo did. Jest is kind of it's like a bunch of glue around several existing tools. So it's using Jasmine's asserts. It's using all of its expectations, but it's running that around the it and describe blocks, the suite and test level blocks are provided by Mocha, and then it has its own little runner layer that provides the file watching, because Mocha's file watching has always been kind of subpar. but all of the node file watching has been a little flaky. So they have their own file watching module that reruns the tests and determines which tests should be rerun depending on which files were changed and that sort of thing. So Grove has been on Jest for a while, and most of our tests in Backbone and Marionette are all written in Jest because they were originally written in Jasmine, and so it was easy to just switch that over to Jest.
Yeah.
I find the same problems in Grove's code base as I found in Pindo's code base, like just assumption of too much responsibility in a single place. In Backbone Marionette, it's 100 lines worth of event handler on the route or on the top level view. You're like, this is all business logic. It shouldn't go in here. At Pindo, it was 400 lines of business logic stuck in a controller method instead of externally on a service. So we've been slowly refactoring that code out to that. Both places we used some form of Selenium driver to do integration tests to get those top level tests. And in both places, we kind of got light coverage in that regards. Those tests are generally harder to write, but more valuable because they catch things that, when written well, they catch things that you wouldn't catch from unit tests or even 2 or 3 component integration tests. Jimmy changed something in this service over here and it has an effect on the login screen. Why does it affect the login screen? Who knew that it was going to affect the login screen? I certainly can't keep all that complexity in my head, but just having the robot run through the login screen or the sign up form or the checkout form can expose a lot of that.
Well, testing was so easy on the back end. You deal with a request and a response. That's a very straightforward way to what's the input going in? What are we getting out? But then you move it to this front end world of event management and side effects and asynchronous calls. And it's very hard to make unit tests connect and show you that the whole picture is working. So it's a struggle that I've had as I moved to the front end, getting that testing picture down. And it's one of those things where, at least on the React side, they say they have an idea about how everyone should do it. And then 6 months later, we are changing that. We're changing how we're talking about this. So, or you inherit a project that just doesn't do testing at all. And that's happened to me a few times.
That's definitely been in my career as well. Front end, back end, it doesn't seem to matter. The problems are still the same, right? Like a Rails code base with 400 lines in every controller method is just as brittle as an Angular code base with 400 lines in every controller method.
So on the side, let's go back to both teams have made choices of switching from an existing framework to Vue. You have been an educator. You have taught boot camps, people one-on-one. I'm sure you've mentored junior devs in your roles. How are these companies going about educating their teams? Because I'm assuming you're not going out and finding tons of Vue developers everywhere, because it's still kind of new relative to everything our world is working in. How are you ramping people up on this stuff?
That's a good question. I think Pindo did a really good job when we made the decision, when we made the call that we were going to be moving to Vue. We sent representatives from each of our front end development teams, each one of the feature teams, to VueConf. We had budget for folks to do to pay for continuing education on those things. I have old relationship with Greg, and Adam was our campus operations manager at the Iron Yard in Orlando. The two of them are doing Vue Mastery these days. So there are a lot of really good resources for folks to learn that stuff. We chose to go to VueConf to get the firsthand knowledge, and also to hold each other accountable through the code review process, right? Like, what are the standards that we're going to uphold? What are we going to look for? What are we going how are we going to address those? How are we going to talk about those to one another so that it doesn't seem like any one person really knows everything, right? And we use the code review process particularly as a way of sharing knowledge. So if there was something that someone was doing, those biweekly meetings we would have, there was something that someone was doing that was useful to the rest of the team, we would do a shared code review. Let's all talk about how this team solved this problem. And inevitably, the different feature teams would solve the same problem in 2 or 3 different ways a piece, right? And we would have to have that come to the table meeting and talk about how each team had done it, what were the pros and cons, and how are we going to choose to do it as a team, and who was going to refactor each of the other implementations. That was that collaborative approach that we took there at Pindo. At Grove, the team is much smaller. We have like 20, 25 software engineers. Most of them are in San Francisco. I'm the only one in Raleigh at the moment, but we're growing the team out here as well. And it's a similar problem, right? A lot of folks have experience with Django and have experience with Angular or React or something like that, but not a lot of folks have experience with Vue.js. So leading lunch and learns, trying to lead lunch and learns, and doing presentations on best practices and opening pull requests and minimizing the number of people who are actually working in the code at one point at a time. We've taken a much slower approach to our migration since we're doing a top-down migration. We've changed our top-level application object from a backbone object to from Marionette application to a Vue component. And we've been very meticulous about going through that. This is going to be the example that we're going to show everybody else. We need to make sure that we don't do too much in this conversion, in this migration, that confuses people. When you're fixing all these problems, why are you fixing? Is this required? Do we have to do this in order to get to Vue? No, we don't. But we should probably do it anyway. We're pulling those out into separate code reviews, into separate merged changes that can go in early, and just focusing on this is the right way to do this. Let's go ahead and start with the style guide, right? Like the style guide says the top level, like singular application should be called the component, the header, the footer, the notification bar, the app. Let's just go with that. Let's just follow the rules as much as we can, and then communicate to the rest of the team why we're following the rules, why we're doing it this way. Let everybody pile on and ask questions. I think like that's the best way for folks to learn, right? Is to actually get in there and see how the code has changed, ingest that, ask questions about it, and if they try to deviate from it, let's go back to the style guide. Let's go back to the documentation. Let's figure out why this is the way it is. Why does the linter hate us for doing this?
Yes.
So I want to dig a little at a passing comment you made and pull out your philosophy from it real quick. We'll get away from Vue for a minute. You talked about Grove. Most of the engineers are in San Francisco. You're the only one in Raleigh at the moment. At Coney, we were the same way, where we had all the developers in the office. So what's the philosophy as far as hiring remote? Or at Grove, are you looking to put people in the office at Raleigh, and do you have a reason for constraining? And I'm using an opinionated word there, constraining your job market. Your job availability in looking at that, or
that's a great question. Well? And I agree with you. I think that anytime that you constrain yourself geographically, you limit your choices and the availability of talent. At most of the places that I've worked, there's been a perception that local developers work better. That having everybody together in a room works better, and certainly that can be a higher bandwidth and easier method of communication, right? Like there's nothing that beats being face to face with another person or elbow to elbow on 2 keyboards when we're pair programming. You don't have to deal with the AV issues, with the latency issues. There was a tweet a little while ago that always makes me laugh. The most unbelievable part about the Star Trek universe was that every ship in the fleet had flawless teleconferencing ability that always worked, except that the ship was like half destroyed. Right? Then you got a little static. So yeah, most of the companies that I've worked for have been local first, and will maybe allow you to be remote if you're really valuable or there are crazy constraints. But you better work really hard to communicate with everybody. That's a double-edged sword, right? Like when we're all local, there's an immense opportunity for interruption from the people that I'm working next to. For example, since starting here at Grove, me and Noah were the only ones in this office. We collaborate a lot. We communicate highly with one another, but that also means that we don't have a lot of alone time. If there's a thing that comes up that's going to affect one or both of us, or if there's an idea that occurs to one of us, we just talk about it. That is, in my opinion and in my experience, a lazy approach to communication. A much more disciplined approach comes when I'm not in the room with someone all of the time. And I feel like in order to be successful at remote employees, in order to have a successful communication network for remotes, you have to be remote first. You have to choose that you're going to be remote, because then you work out the hard problems first, and don't get lazy with on-sites. And I think that even if you're remote first and you're not remote only, there still becomes a us versus them, the locals versus remotes, because of that ease with which I can interrupt one of my neighbors. And people don't realize how valuable it is to not be interrupted when you're doing this work.
Yes.
Absolutely. And I'll go one step further, and it's not just this work. For the most part, it's any work that requires concentration and continuity of thought. Just a completely non sequitur example. My daughter works in translation, and she works inside an office. So she's heads down translating something. Right. Somebody comes up, interrupts her, and it breaks her flow. And she's been trying to work with her company on getting them away from, getting them to where they can separate themselves, getting them to where maybe they can work from home some, just so they can have that continuity of focus. So it's absolutely part of it. But I wanted to poke at that a little, because I knew Coney was the way it was, and it sounded like Grove was headed that direction. And you're right. Even if you're remote first, but you're not remote only, you get a little bit of the localization. But it will fail if it's not remote first. Period. You can make it work otherwise, but if it's remote first, but you have some co-location, but you have to start remote first. You have to build in all the process. I've managed remote for 20 years, so it's certainly something you have to think about.
Yeah.
So what now we'll circle back around. I warned you ahead of time this was a stream of consciousness podcast. The Vue versus React. When we're talking about technology, and we're talking about languages, and we're talking about anything, anyone where you're comparing products, you have Betamax versus
that other thing that won.
That other thing that actually turned out to be the thing we all use. Whatever.
That inferior product for VHS.
VHS, right? You had Betamax versus VHS. You have Rails versus the world. Rails ended up taking over the framework world for a little while.
Yeah.
You've got React Vue, where React is the more popular one.
For the moment.
For the moment. And I hear you. I hear you chiming up for the Vue side there. So and that's why where I wanted to take this conversation is everyone that I've talked to, very smart people, because we've had Greg on as well. We had Greg on a while back.
Mm-hmm.
if they've evaluated both and they've evaluated both React and Vue fairly, they end up coming out on the Vue end. Yet React is the more popular one at the moment.
Right.
So do you see yourself screaming into the hurricane to where you're always going to be fighting that battle of being the better one, but the less popular one? Does that matter? I mean, I lived on the side of it of Drupal versus WordPress.
Right.
Where I did a lot of Drupal work, where Drupal was probably the more powerful, the more enterprisey one, but WordPress was the more popular one. So where do you see the future taking that battle going forward?
Yeah. That's a head scratcher there. I don't know. I've had a pretty good career of picking the popular winner a little early. Like I tend to hang back and not grab cutting edge, bleeding edge, anything near the edge. It's just, claustrophobia, or not claustrophobia. I'm afraid of heights, really. I don't want to fall off the edge. So I've been pretty good at picking the winning horse after the second lap. If that makes sense, right? Like, so in the PHP days, it was Zen Framework. Zen Framework was not the most popular, but it was the one that was shoved down everybody's throat. There were alternatives at the time when Zen was trying to shove it down everybody's throat that were more popular or less popular. And eventually, I think Symfony won. But at the time, Zen was the right choice. And I eventually kicked people towards Symfony, but before I left PHP for the most part. We're WordPress versus Drupal, right? I spoke at both WordCamp and DrupalCamp almost every year. Never really spoke much on either one of those two platforms, something around the two platforms, maybe development process or particular tools that you could use in conjunction with the two of them. I did a lot more work in WordPress than I did in Drupal. In the early days, it was Backbone, and then this new Angular kid that had come out, and I picked Angular, and that turned out to be a pretty good choice until the next new kid came along. Right? I did a lot of work. I did some work with React, and while I enjoyed the work, it felt a little too weird, and it didn't feel like a step towards the right answer. The right answer being real web components. There was a while there where people were comparing: is Angular better than Polymer? No, Polymer's different. I think it is better, but it's different. It's a different thing. I don't know. I'm always looking for what's going to take me closer to what I feel like is the best answer, the answer that's going to go live in the browser long term. What's the answer that's going to go live on the server long term? What's going to get us there long term? And to me, Vue feels like that. When you see features that Vue is pioneering that other frameworks are emulating, that's a good indicator. Vue's also taken a lot of stuff from React as well. Like React announced hooks. Vue had an implementation of hooks within a couple weeks.
And they've never. I mean, that's kind of one of the endearing things about Vue is that because it's open source, it always seems like Evan Vue has always kind of said, yes, I religiously take the best things from both Angular and React and put them into Vue. And I've always been like, that's awesome. Like just that's the whole point of open source is improvement across all the platforms. So
I think I have a lot of respect for Evan on various levels, one of which being he does weigh the best ideas, but he also doesn't jump on every idea. He's got a steady hand when it comes to how far the throttle is on Vue. He said no to a lot of things that everyone's like, why didn't you build that into the thing? Why don't you let other contributors in? We would totally open pull requests. He's like, no, I think we should go at this pace. I have a family. I want other people to have a family. I want to spend time with my family. I also want to write this cool piece of software. I don't think it's necessary for us to cram in every crazy feature idea or request. We should have a careful, thought out approach to how we're going to build
Yeah.
this thing. The recent slots refactor, right? That was like, oh, maybe that slots thing, the thing that we tried to do with slots, that wasn't so smart. This is smarter. Let's do this other smarter thing.
Well, I mean, we've talked about
Sure.
Rails, and now we've talked about Evan. DHH was, of course, the driver behind Rails, and a lot of the success of that platform goes back to the way he kind of led it. And Evan's a different personality, but that's what React lacks. Like, you might put Dan Abramov in that category, but he truly doesn't make every decision. He's just kind of a spokesperson. So it's Vue has like Angular. I couldn't tell you who the heck's in charge of it, but Vue goes back to Evan. Like he is
Right.
he's not a dictator, but he's definitely the heart and soul of it all, I would say. So
yeah, it's the Guido Rossum benevolent dictator for life approach, right? Like, I'm not going to tell you what to do, but I will tell you what we're not going to do.
Yeah.
Whereas DHH was definitely is still definitely the this is what we are going to do, right? The Rails as omakase speech that he gave is like, that summed it up. Thanks, DHH. We all get it now.
Exactly.
Basically, Rails is what makes me happy. But there, you talk to some of the Rails folks, and there's tons of stuff inside of Rails that got off the rails,
totally.
right? Like the whole turbo links thing, where that was basically there just so that Basecamp can continue to exist and start incorporating front end stuff. And it's never made its way out. Like, please just kill that, would you? There's some really wacky stuff in the active support side of things where they, monkey patch the string class. There's a lot less of that in Vue, and I think, to your point about Dan as the benevolent dictator for life, or the they call him the prophet, as the prophet of the React community. He's stayed very hyper focused on React as the virtual DOM rendering thing, React. And let me just stay focused on that. And that has created the splintering of the rest of the ecosystem, because you can't have a framework that's just a rendering library.
Yeah, you always have to bring in the other tools. It just doesn't work by itself.
Right.
So, David, thank you for joining us today. This was a great discussion. Absolutely. Where can our listeners find more about you, more about Grove on the internet?
Yeah, Grove is grove.co. That you can find more about them there. They're good at marketing. And I'm mostly known on the internet as Al the X. David Rogers is far too common a name, and even if you look for David Rogers, senior software engineer in Raleigh, North Carolina, you would not believe how many people we have interviewed whose names was David, or kept joking, we're just going to create an office of Davids. You cannot work here unless your name is David, just so we can keep track of all the people in North Carolina. There's just the David crowd. So I go by Al the X online. If you look for Al the X, you will only find me. There's Google will do some bad things to the query, but I'm on LinkedIn as LinkedIn Al the X. I'm on Twitter as Al the X with underscores between the words. I'm on GitHub as Al the X with dashes between the words, because GitHub doesn't do underscores. They're not allowed in here. And I'm on althex.me with dashes between the words, al-the-x.me.
All right. Well, again, thank you. I think it sounds like you've got a cough going on. Randy's recovering from a flu. I had food poisoning on Tuesday, so we're all pushing through to try and get a little relaxation. So, So thanks again, Randy. Any final words?
No. Well, just thank you. I think. I talk to people all the time. What stack should we be using? What should we be like? How do we keep up with all of this massive change on the front end? And I really think that you have a valid experience with the change and switching and making the choice. And that's really valuable. So thank you for coming on. And I'm going to presume that we will reach out to you again to talk to you more about this stuff, because
I'd love to tell you more about how we go, how things go at Grow.
Sounds great.
All right. Well, have a great weekend, guys, and we'll talk again soon.
Talk to you
Later.
soon, okay? Bye.
Thanks for listening to This Old App. Show notes and previous episodes can be found on our website at www.thisoldapp.online. Reviews on Apple iTunes are always appreciated and help promote the show. For questions, comments, or things you would like to hear on future shows, please email us at hello@thisoldapp.online. Show music is Guns Blazing by Fab Claxton, licensed by Pond 5. Voiceover work by MeganVoices.com. You'll hear from us soon.